A Shard of Divinity. Drexel surveyed the future battlefield as he soared across the sky, lush emerald green grass and small rolling hills for as far as his eyes could see. Squinting to the east and facing the rising sun, he found the Espen war camps preparing for the upcoming battle miles away. He could hardly imagine that in less than 4 hours, these hills would be painted blood red and littered with corpses. Oh, what a glorious day this will be, he said to himself excitedly. As Drexel turned to fly back to the Eshon camps, he spotted his friend, Kilden. Not that he had been difficult to find, adorned in his pitch-black plated armor that feels to be all-consuming of the light around him. Drexel had teased his friend on this matter many times in their history together, of course. He often likened it to Kilden sucking the fun and joy out of everyone around him. The two had always been something of an odd pair, Kilden and him. Drexel appears to take nothing seriously, while Kilden perhaps far too seriously. But their century of battles and adventures together had proven the two to be effective if nothing else. "Hope you're watching, Malky." He clutched onto the amulet gifted to him by the god of chaos himself and descended. "See anything useful on your little joyride?" Kilden asked as the surrounding soldiers made room for Drexel to land. "Nothing really." "Oh." There was a lady on the other side that was rather well endowed. Drexel smirked. "She'd be perfect for you, Keldy." Kilden sighed. "I believe I told you next time you bring that up, Rossi will finally take you. I'm not worried. Your goddess of death and I are great pals. I probably pray to her more than you do nowadays even," he teased. "Watch it, Drexel," Kilden warned under his breath. "Besides, I figured little Ness needs a motherly figure since the lance left the both of you." "Enough, Drexel," Kilden said with a firmness that caused the radius of bystanders around the pair to grow. Despite them and the soldiers being a part of the same army, Drexel and Kilden were only mercenaries, albeit mercenaries with the infamy to rival the gods. Kilden was an archmage wielding magic more powerful than any man had once even imagined, and Kilden was a paladin of Varasi, her mightiest and most loyal crusader nonetheless. Everywhere they walked, death and destruction followed, and yet here they stood bickering like any other men. "Honestly though, Kilden, this is the largest battle in, well, all of man," he said, uncharacteristically serious. "Who's to take care of your little girl when you're gone? I know it feels like it at times, but need I remind you that we are not truly immortal?" "I realize it, and if I do pass, I suppose she'll unfortunately have to fall under your care. Not sure that's a great idea unless you want her running around kicking the groins of every boy that so much glances her way. Besides, I'm only human. Aren't you elves supposed to live practically forever? You aren't the one about to be in melee with thousands of men ready to face their death, Drexel. Although, you are correct on one account. Varasi would have taken your life years ago if not for your damned amulet. You're just jealous you aren't the only one of us blessed by the gods," he said snarkily. "You'd miss me too much as well. Just admit it." Kilden grunted in reply as he turned to leave. "Death will take us both by the balls one day, Kilden." Kilden marched away in an attempt to ignore Drexel and created a part in the sea of soldiers as he passed. Unfortunately, Drexel always had a way of getting into his head, especially when he's right. His wife, Ilanth, had left him and their daughter. It turned out that being an unyielding paladin of death for hire had not turned him into a great husband. And although he would never admit it, Kilden still had nightmares of the night Ilanth left him less than a year ago. The two of them were visiting her sickly mother, a woman that was nearly as old as the world, just over a millennium old. Her life had been rich and fulfilling, and Kilden, bound by his duty as a paladin of Varasi, had to carry out his sacred duty on that fateful rainy night. However, the expression of pure shock on Ilanth's face when he told her of the task he was burdened with would forever haunt him. Kilden couldn't recall much of that night, but he remembered how he had to rely on his decades in the clergy to blank his mind, to block out Ilanth's screams. He remembered standing over her resting mother as she pounded on his back and tried with all of her might to stop Kilden. And he also remembered ignoring her. He remembered gently uttering the sacred oath, "All things must come to an end." And in a mindless act of mercy, he granted his mother-in-law a release from her pain, completing her life journey the only way he ever knew how, with a sword through her heart. Kilden had ended countless lives before, tens of thousands of deaths from his hands, all without a single shred of regret. He had upheld his devotion to Varasi perfectly. However, when he witnessed his life's love break into tears and screams, he felt it all shatter. Every ounce of faith, every oath he's ever taken, every fiber of his being crumbled into nothing. Suddenly, the weight of every life he had taken crushed him as Ilanth's tears washed away the doctrines he once held dear. When he awoke the next morning, he found that Elanthe had left with her mother's body. To this day, her whereabouts are unknown, and Keldon hadn't yet found the courage to find her. Now alone, he no longer truly believed in Varasi's teachings. However, after hundreds of years, it was all he had left to hold on to. As Keldon headed to the command tent, his conversation with Drexel about nests echoed in his mind. His daughter had also been indoctrinated into becoming a follower of Varasi, just as he was, but perhaps it wasn't too late for her to forge a different path. An impossibility with Keldon as her father, of course. But what if he were to die today? Was there a chance that Drexel could actually do any better? Drexel was perhaps the furthest thing from a perfect role model, and yet Keldon trusted the man with his life. Why not Nessa's? Keldon shook his head at the thought, arriving at the tent, as he knew that death would not come easily to him regardless. The two guards at the entrance held the flaps open for him as he sauntered inside without a word. Keldon may just be a hired man, but he bore as much authority as any commander, if not more. Stepping inside, he paused for a moment to allow his eyes to adjust to the dim room lit only by a few candles after the front flaps were closed. Inside, he found 3 officers, all dressed in Eshan blue, with varying amounts of gold trims depending on rank, huddled around a grand table that laid a map. The 3 of them acknowledged Keldon with a simple head nod as they made room in the cramped tent. "Your spies are accurate. It all seems in order. Drexel had just confirmed it," Keldon said. "Good," the highest-ranked officer replied. "We'll continue on with the plan, then." "I'm not certain I'd call slaughtering every poor sod standing before me on my way to King Atur's pavilion as much of a plan, Boren. But it will be done," he grimaced. Despite it just being over 1,000 years since the gods made the world, there had been surprisingly few wars since the first war of creation, and as a result, the present wars were brutally simplistic, where submission was won by killing the opposition's king or queen. Another of the officers gave a soft cough into their fist. "Sorry. There, Boren," Keldon sighed. "Damn Drexel's finally starting to wear on me after all these decades." "Are you sure you can trust his reports, Keldon?" Boren asked. "Drexel may be an undying pain in my ass, however he's anything but incompetent," he explained. "You can trust him. On this matter, at least." "Very well. Then are you certain you don't want at least a small company by your side during the battle? I've heard the tales, but surely even you can't take on an army alone." "I won't be alone. Drexel will be granting support from the skies nearby, and you're already sending your army ahead to take the brunt of the initial conflict. There will be nothing but death surrounding me there. I assume your men don't wish to be caught in the massacre." He paused and watched the commanders give each other uncertain glances before he broke the silence with a disappointed sigh. "I suppose having a team of clerics in the vicinity would be appropriate. However, remind them to keep their distance unless absolutely necessary." They all gave signs of relief after being assured that their trump card wouldn't die to a stray arrow. Not that it had concerned Keldon in the slightest. "They'll be arranged to meet outside of your tent shortly," Boren said. "Prepare yourself. We'll march at noon." Keldon saluted as he retreated from the room, a gesture normally below his station, but he felt a need to amend his earlier blunder of not addressing Boren's title. His shoulders slumped as he looked to the sky towards Varasi's constellation after he rejoined the camp outside. Although it usually can't be seen during daylight, his connection to the goddess allowed him to feel her at all times. Only 3 hours left. Keldon closed his eyes and stood deathly still. He immersed himself in the cacophony of life surrounding him. The deafening sounds of men preparing for war felt to him as if he were standing in a tranquil field in comparison to the unending death throes to come, a sound that he'd grown far too familiar with in his lifetime. Keldon steeled himself before returning to his tent for his last respite, and released a heavy sigh when he realized he'd have to deal with Drexel again before long. People stared in awe as they watched the rat flee the mess hall with an entire loaf of bread in his mouth that was thrice its size. Yells came from the crowd as they witnessed the same rat slowly morph into a human. Angry guards rushed to the center of the crowd where they found an insouciant Drexel standing amongst the chaos. "What? Never seen a man grabbing an early lunch?" he said. Drexel feigned shock as shouts rang from the mess hall that had also erupted in chaos. "They might need some help in there, by the way," he explained, pointing to the kitchens. "It appears they have something of a rat problem." The guard scowled at Drexel before recoiling upon recognizing him. "You stay right there, Harbinger," one of them growled. "Boren will hear this." "I'm sure he will." Drexel shrugged off the warnings as the soldiers ran off to aid the kitchens. He took a bite out of the loaf, then spitting it out immediately. "Ugh, the battle to decide the fate of their country and they can't even afford decent bread." Drexel groaned as he tossed the loaf to an unsuspecting bystander. The person struggled to catch it, and ultimately dropped the loaf of bread. Shielding his eyes with his hands, Drexel looked towards the sun. About 2 hours, seems, he said to himself in anticipation. Suppose it is finally time I prepare for everything? Drexel then retreated into his tent. His tent had originally been smaller than Keldon's. That was before he joked that he'd raised Born's command post to the ground. They settled on a tent that was the same size as the Paladin's, despite Drexel's ongoing protest. Inside were scrolls, books, and magical trinkets littered all about the floor. Miraculously, a sole wooden working desk sat cramped at the edge of the room. That was where he decided to lay his bedroll atop of. Drexel rummaged around until he finally found a smoking pipe and shoved apart the mess to create an opening for him to sit down. Reaching into his cloak's inner pocket, he grabbed a small pouch of hallucinogens he stole from one of the chefs earlier. He could always rely on cooks to have some on hand for some reason. As he lit his pipes, he noticed his laybooks lying about haphazardly. Gotta remember to memorize those spells after too, he thought. Won't be hearing the end of it if old Keldy doesn't get his haste. People revered Keldon, and Drexel couldn't blame them. His companion was the embodiment of death and perhaps the closest a mortal could come to becoming a god themselves. Keldon received all the fame and fortune while Drexel, at best, were merely tolerated. Nobody realized that Keldon wouldn't be half the man without the wizard always by his side. Drexel was never jealous or bothered, however. He was perfectly content with laying in the shadows, providing his unwavering support as Keldon basked in the limelight. Leaning back against the flimsy walls, Drexel felt the effects of the drugs taking hold. Eventually, his ego dissolved, and he felt his body floating away. Drexel had to pour everything into focusing in an attempt to break his mind free of his worldly binds and commune with the gods. He cursed at Keldon for his ability to do this as easily as he breathed. Having a fragment of your god dwelling within you was just cheating, he thought. Long gone were the days where gods walked the lands and one could simply sit them down for a chat. Nowadays, most clerics and priests have to meditate on hours on end just to conjure a single word from them. Of course, some of the clergy had known that drugs were a shortcut to their realm, although it was heavily frowned upon. Thankfully, Drexel had never been a pious man. Before him materialized a hazy apparition of Malchus. Draped in a billowing dark robe, his long black hair flowing, Malchus exuded an air of absolute confidence. "Hello there," the voice seemed to strangely echo from both the apparition and within his mind. "It's about damn time, Drexel. You know it's considered rude to keep a god waiting," Malchus said with a mischievous smile. "Sorry, Malky," Drexel slurred. Bit preoccupied." The god glided towards Drexel, his long black hair flowing behind him, and waved his hand over Drexel's glazed eyes. "Huh, I can see that," he chuckled. "I take it then everything's prepared and ready, child?" "Of course. The lube's ready and everything," Drexel joked. Malchus burst into a boisterous laugh, his grin devilish. "Perfect then. Let us begin." Frantically, he worked alongside Malchus, etching rune after rune into the scattered pages around him. He knew that he only had a couple of fleeting hours before the hallucinogens ran out and Malchus left his mind. During that time, he shared with him knowledge that previously belonged solely to the gods. Such knowledge would have shattered any mortal's mind, but Drexel had dedicated his life to Malchus's quest, preparing for the singular moment. Malchus had first approached them well over 90 years ago. He was in his early 20s and had been adventuring with Keldon for a mere 3 years. In that short time, however, the pair were already viewed as inseparable, their destinies forever intertwined. Where you would find one, the other would surely be near. So when Malchus told him of Keldon's eventual fate, Drexel was set immediately into motion. Throughout his life, others had always claimed Drexel squandered his immense potential due to his lackadaisical attitude. He never cared, however. He often wondered why it mattered if he was perfectly good enough until Malchus told him that he wasn't, and even Drexel hadn't been stubborn enough to ignore God. And so, Drexel listened and did his every bidding. He studied every subject known to man, from the arcane to legalese, despite his naturally nonchalant nature, and soon learned that he'd do anything to save his lifelong companion, including driving a nation to the brink of civil war. Finally, after some time of intense and feverish work, he finished the prelude to the ritual and took off his amulet. The solid gold amulet weighed heavily in his hands. It featured a brilliant diamond encrusted in the center, surrounded by 3 smaller, round-cut rubies. The artifact was gifted by Malchus upon their first meeting. Legends told of its unholy ability to steal the souls of men into its gems and allow Drexel to wield the power that it held however he saw fit. The legends hadn't mentioned, however, that the amulet was not just limited to mortal souls. The next hour blurred for Drexel as he was immersed in a grueling ritual to unlock the amulet's full potential. He casted spells he only vaguely understood, spoke a language indecipherable to any other mortal, and was nearly unconscious throughout from both the drugs and sheer exhaustion. He worked purely through his hard-earned instincts. When he finally emerged from the trance-like state, he stared in awe at his bedroll that floated in the middle of the room before noticing how everything was in turmoil. His once perfectly organized chaos had now completely been run through. Drexel ran a hand through his short black hair and sat in disbelief when he realized that nearly all of his spells were spent as well. "Well, fuck," he said. Groggily, Drexel stood up and carefully walked around the bedroll to the entrance. He slowly lifted the flaps and was momentarily blinded by the light outside. When his vision cleared, he found an empty war camp. Shit. The battle had already begun. Keldon stood patiently in the now empty war camps while Dearborn paced around him. "Where in the stairs hell is he?" Dearborn shouted, rattling the half-dozen clerics on standby. Keldon figured by their simple beige robes that most of them were barely apprentices. They were children in their teens who were hastily drafted. "Patience," he said calmly. "Drexel will be here. In time." "Patience, Keldon, is something we are running frustratingly low on," Born replied through gritted teeth. "This was accounted for, Dearborn. You were all aware of his tendencies when you hired him. It was always the plan to delay me from entering the fray anyhow. Recall our conversations where you and the others decided I should sneak into the battle, rather than let me spearhead the army as I had suggested. We agreed on half an hour at most. It's been nearly an hour. Our men are dying by the minute while we sit on our asses waiting for Malchus's bastard. Your men," Keldon seethed, his composure finally breaking. "It is your men that are dying. Your men that are charging bravely to their deaths while their commander stands before me whining. How, I wonder, were you not ashamed of your thinly veiled cowardice as you sent those men to their deaths alone without their leader?" Dearborn's eyes lit with anger, but was too shocked by Keldon's sudden outburst to speak back. "Hey!" Drexel yelled from a distance, interrupting the conversation. "Where's everyone at? Did I miss the party?" Stunned, Dearborn turned to Drexel, his mouth agape as if to scream. However, he chose to stay silent and stormed off in defeat without uttering another word. "Sheesh! Who's got the staff up his ass?" Drexel asked. Keldon glared at him. Drexel exaggeratedly turned to look behind him, then pointed to himself. "Don't look at me. Not my type, to be frank. Too bitchy for my liking." He sighed. "You're late. Not too surprising. You know me so well, Keldy. What have you been up to this time?" "Oh, just hanging out with Malchus, and, planning to undermine your goddess. The usual, basically." He sighed again. "I shouldn't have asked. Let us not waste any more time, Drexel. The tides of the battle could turn at any minute now." Drexel muttered under his breath, although loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's always buff me up, Drexel, or do this for me, Drexel. I'm never pretty pleased, Drexel. I'll be forever indebted to you, Drexel." He started to pull spell scrolls out of his magic bag. Keldon raised an eyebrow. "Thought we were saving those for a rainy day." "Keldy, my dear, we've been saying that for decades now. Thought we should stop hoarding and finally use some of them." He didn't raise any more protest as Drexel casted a myriad of spells on him before the pair and his clerics left for the battle. Enhanced by Drexel's scrolls, Keldon surged ahead of the group and arrived at the hills within minutes. He scanned the scene and saw hundreds of individual battles happening all at once. It was mass carnage unlike anything he's ever seen, and felt an unfamiliar pang of disgust. However, he knew that he had a job to do, and sent a prayer to Verasi as he donned his obsidian longsword and magical shield. As Keldon joined the fray, his mere presence brought immediate order to the chaos as fighters on both sides of the war were quickly made aware of his appearance. The Eshon soldiers, his allies, promptly moved their fights away to grant him more room, while the Espen soldiers nearby abandoned theirs to engage Keldon. Although surrounded by his enemies, he couldn't help but harbor respect for his fellow men. Their palpable fear had smothered the air, and yet they fought. It reminded him of what first drew him to Verasi all those years ago. The privilege of being able to grant a righteous death to men like these. And, even after Ilanth, he still saw the beauty of death, as much as he has also grown to despise it. He drew in one last deep breath to focus himself and prepare to charge at the Espen men. Keldon became a tempest in battle, a violent force of nature cloaked in mortal guise. With lightning speed, he blitzed towards the unfortunate soul standing before him. The enemy, taken off guard, futilely raised their shield, but Keldon effortlessly cleaved them in half with a single fluid motion, severing both arms and torso. As Keldon's black blade left the body, a terrible thunderous boom erupted, born of the sheer power behind his strike and divine magic. The concussive force sent the nearby combatants hurtling through the air, claiming lives in their wake. The destructive thunder and subsequent burst of crimson blood and Esbon purple had quickly alerted a large squad of archers of his location. It was not long before a hail of arrows were released upon him. Keldon raised his shield overhead as its magic compelled arrows to veer directly towards it. A dizzying vortex of projectiles formed above him as they rained down upon him. Drexel's spell deflected the majority, while the remaining arrows pinged off his shield benignly. Momentarily lowering his shield, Keldon advanced as the archers prepared to unleash another barrage. It was then he noticed fiery streaks streaming across the skies. It appeared Drexel had arrived. High above the carnage, Drexel whistled in awe as his meteors devastated the Espen army. Truth be told, this was the first time he'd ever unleashed this spell, as opportunities to summon swarms of meteors upon the land from over a mile away were unfortunately very few. Keldon could best any man or woman in combat, but Drexel? He could level entire armies. Cracking his knuckles, Drexel readied himself to plunge into the chaos, hurling handfuls of spell scrolls into the air. He soon was lightly shrouded by his scrolls, ready to be casted at a moment's notice. The pair worked in harmony in battle like countless times before. Keldon's destruction was exacting. He cleaved through the enemy's forces and was ever advancing. Meanwhile, Drexel followed well behind, decimating Espen's backline indiscriminately and shielding Keldon's flank as he flew. Wizards may be notoriously fragile, but it's all for naught if he stayed far from the fray. Most mages would be outranged by the archers. However, Drexel's magic was far more potent than most. In under half an hour, they destroyed a quarter of Espen's forces by his estimation, during which it appeared that Espen had amassed a squad of mages and they were flying straight to Drexel. A dozen wizards and sorcerers soared past Keldon in the front lines as arrows flew from Eshan bowmen. Drexel smiled as he watched the arrows deflect from the squadron, piercing only one man as they approached. "Not bad," he playfully remarked. "Martha's tits be damned," Keldon cursed. Drexel's immense power was daunting, and yet even he was vulnerable when faced with that many potential counterspells. Momentarily distracted, a sword swung at Keldon from his periphery. Narrowly dodging the strike, he swiftly disengaged and scanned around. He was alone, and surrounded by Espen forces, no Eshan soldiers in sight. "Perfect," he muttered under his breath. Once more, the fighter he dueled rushed at him. She was a formidable opponent. Their battle waged for what felt like an eternity, although it had only been a minute. Drawing in a deep breath, Keldon stood resolute in the presence of his adversary. He flourished his obsidian blade into the air, catching it in both hands and pointing it downward. "There is no life without death. In death, there is freedom. The inevitable has come, and I am its bringer," Keldon chanted. As the fighter lunged at him again, Keldon struck the ground, channeling immense divine energy. A wave of destruction, radiant and lightning blue, effortlessly eradicated everyone around him, leaving none alive. Keldon released a heavy sigh in the settling dust. Time to save his sorry ass again. Struggling against the approaching mages with his dwindling spells, Drexel rummaged through his bag only to find it empty. "You better be right about this, Malky," he prayed. Spotting Keldon rushing towards him, Drexel immediately flew to his companion and pulled out one last spell scroll from his robe's pocket. Keldon, arms extended, reached out to Drexel. Their hands locked as Drexel casted the scroll. "Fly," he chanted as countless fireballs exploded upon the pair.